So I was just starting out with some thoughts, and then we can go to a question. But yeah, so what I was thinking about in Dhammarato's approach that he calls the soft approach is the primary element of seeing the Dhamma is seeing dependent origination. If you see dependent origination, you see the Dhamma. You see Dhamma, you see dependent origination. You see dependent origination, you see the Buddha. You see the Buddha, you see dependent origination. And Ajahn Buddhadasa spoke of dependent origination, and it's in the suttas as well, the Anuloma and the Patiloma side of it, where it goes in the arising order and then in the cessation order. And that transcendental dependent origination has sort of an unfolding of conditions that lead to liberation. And so oftentimes it starts with, faith or confidence, saddha, and other formulations it starts with virtue. But the part that caught my attention was following virtue. There's feelings of, piti and sukha, followed by samadhi or pamoja, right? So feelings of success, feelings of happiness, followed by the mind becoming unified or composed. And when the mind becomes unified and composed, then it gains knowledge and vision of the way things are. So when the mind gains knowledge and vision of the way things are, then it becomes disenchanted with its objects, right? And then it gains dispassion. So that's sort of the cessation of craving. Disenchantment is like, it can no longer fool you, and then can no longer create delusion, no longer create doubt. And then dispassion is like, you no longer crave it. And then this dispassion leads onto relinquishment, and then relinquishment leads, to the cessation of clinging, the cessation of taking ownership of all of these phenomena, and then that leads to the fruit of knowledge and liberation, knowledge of the path and knowledge of liberation, being freed of the taints and whatnot. And the popular way to approach this is what Dhammarato calls the hard approach, which is to tie the mind to the body or tie the mind to the precepts and let it sort of kick and squirm and calm down through sense restraint, which is good, actually. That works pretty well. I've definitely done that through a lot of my practice, and it's important. But I was thinking of how the word satisfaction is almost like a dirty word in other Buddhist circles. They think of satisfaction as what you gain from sense pleasures, but that's not what we do here, right? We practice satisfaction for its own sake, meaning that we're happy and satisfied without having to add anything to our experience. And so there's another way to, I think of satisfaction in the context that we practice it. You could think of it as the word khanti, which is usually translated as patient endurance. But that word patient endurance, when you put that in English, it sounds like you're just sort of suppressing craving. But satisfaction is the abandoning of craving. So true patience is not to be waiting, right? It's to be in an absence of non-waiting, non-wanting. So that's the type of satisfaction that we practice here. I wanted to clarify that. The satisfaction that we practice is to be in a state of not waiting for the next thing, not wanting what we don't have, not wanting to get rid of what we do have, not making a fuss out of what we don't like. And so what that creates is, a continuously wholesome mind, because we've decided to have this attitude of satisfaction, to incline the mind towards letting go, not needing what it doesn't have. And that inclination then leads the mind to be happy, right? First, you have that PT, that feeling of success, like, holy moly, I can actually just decide to be okay with the way things are. I don't have to waste my life worrying. I don't have to waste my life feeling anxious. I don't have to waste my life feeling like I want things that I don't have. I don't have to waste my time having ill will towards people. I can sit here and be free of desire and free of ill will and just be happy and satisfied with the way things are, and feel friendly internally and feel friendly externally, and be in a state of non-greed, non-hatred, and non-delusion just by choice. And that leads to this feeling of success, right? Because we're achieving what the Dhamma promises just by making this choice when we learn that it's there for us. And that makes the mind delighted. And then that happy, delighted mind that's already started with satisfaction then becomes easily composed or unified or gathered together. It becomes easily samadhied, you can say. And then that gives us knowledge and vision of the way things are, because the mind is stable and clear and calm. It's not spinning around in circles. It's not chasing after things. It's not running away from things. We begin to see the things as they are. When emotion arises, we're like, oh, there you are. I remember you. We can see it and let it go. When old desires arise, old habits arise, we can say, oh, I see you, and then we can let it go. And that further builds up our confidence, and we become sort of dispassionate or disenchanted by all of the behaviors of the mind in that way. It no longer can fool us. Like, I use the example of coming out of a toxic relationship, or perhaps somebody who used to do drugs, and the friends they used to do drugs with, and they've now sobered up, and their friends used to be able to talk them into coming back, but now no matter what their friends say, it doesn't grab their attention. It no longer is capable of enchanting the mind. So that's that disenchantment, that nibbida. And then the dispassion follows when the mind sees how good it feels to be free of greed, hatred, and delusion, to be free of wanting and ill will. And that clarifies all of the aspects of our experience that we are used to think we had control over, that we used to feel like we were the owners of, like, namely the 5 aggregates, the 6 sense bases, the 4 foundations of mindfulness, all the different constituents of our experience in modern language, the body, the mind, all the different mental habits, the emotions, memories, perceptions, beliefs, views, opinions, all the things by which we identify ourselves no longer have their hooks in us. And so we are able to give that all back to nature, as Buddhadasa says. And so through all of these stages, that sense of satisfaction is deepening and increasing. It's getting stronger, it's getting deeper, it's becoming more complete. We're gaining more confidence, we're becoming more free. And then, if we keep that going, it becomes so continuous that as long as we stay mindful and stay satisfied, we no longer need to fill the mind with wholesome thoughts. We can just sort of abide happily in the way things are. And whereas maybe in the beginning people feel like they're lying to themselves because they're telling themselves a different story, they now see that the old story was the lie, and the idea that everything is already okay exactly as it is what the truth actually is. So that's how the sort of the easy path cuts straight through the Gordian knot. It doesn't require as much prerequisite work. But maybe it doesn't work for everybody. But I think all of us here feel that it has worked for us. And the other point I wanted to make in that regard is the other mistake that people make is when they hear us talk about we're satisfied with the way things are, they think that we're saying that we're okay giving into sensuality, that we're going to go drink, we're going to go do drugs, we're going to go do whatever we want because everything's okay. Now, what we're saying is we're okay already, so we don't need all that stuff, right? It's not permission to go and pursue sensuality. If an old habit drags you into that, then you're okay and you let it go. You're not creating new bad feelings that will then perpetuate the problem. So there's advantage there too. So it's more complicated than I'm putting it, but this is sort of the way I see how beginning with satisfaction leads us through that same process of transcendental dependent origination that the Buddha talks about. That's what was on my mind today.
Yeah, that's very well put, Michael. Thank you for that.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's sort of how I define satisfaction as well. Like was my understanding of it from the talks I've heard here. And yeah, I can see how some people might see it differently, but yeah, what you said makes sense. And then you were talking about like starting out having thoughts and then eventually I guess you have more space in between thoughts or something like that. Is that just something that naturally happens?
Yeah, I've heard Michael talk on this, so I would invite you, Michael, to share your thoughts on this too, or Dhammadas, anybody who wants to. I can start. For me, I think that when I first started this type of practice, it felt like a chore to cultivate wholesome thoughts. But then I remembered, oh, that's actually the definition of noble right effort. So I actually should be doing this, right? So I started doing it, and at a certain point, yeah, there's that feeling of coolness, that feeling of everything actually being okay started to really permeate experience, and it started to become true. But there was an even different shift where I started to see or discern, and you guys can comment on this if it's true or different for you, but I started to discern between thoughts and attitude. Attitude to me is much more primary than thoughts, and it's free of thoughts. It's the disposition of the mind, it's the inclination of the mind. That's why it makes such a great translation of Samma Sankappa, which is normally translated as right inclination, right intention, right thought. But it's the way that the mind inclines. And the traditional definition of Samma Sankappa is that the mind inclines towards non-greed, non-hatred, non-ill will, towards renunciation, because the mind is normally chasing after objects of the senses. So it's normally imbued with greed, hatred, and delusion, right? And Samma Sankappa, after you've had the view, the aim of Nibbana, is that the mind is going to incline towards letting go, essentially. And so it's a disposition, it's like a shift in energy, it's deeper than thinking, and you have to sort of first start by cultivating wholesome thoughts in order to make the mind clean enough so that you can start seeing how attitude is something that you can push in one direction or the other, or cultivate in one direction or the other. Dhammarato talks about like putting the back cut in a tree when you fell a tree, like the direction you want it to go is determined by the back cut. Or the attitude of a building, it has to be perfectly perpendicular to the ground so that it doesn't fall over. But so attitude is leaning, right? So that's what you kind of discover after you've been cultivating wholesome thoughts for a long time. You start to discover that prior to the thoughts is this attitude. It's sort of the temperament of the mind. It's the lean of the mind. And someone who has a mind that leans towards irritation, that every little thing will create thoughts of irritation, and then thoughts of anger, and then emotions, right? So that's what I found, is that there's a certain point where the thinking clarifies the mind to the point where you discover that the mind is now leaning in a wholesome direction, so that if you stub your toe, since your mind is already inclining towards joy, you experience joy when you stub your toe. If your mind is inclining towards joy, then, or letting go, then when things go wrong, then the mind naturally responds with letting go, with non-ill will, non-hatred, non-delusion, with joy, with success, with feeling like a winner, because you've trained the mind to lean in that direction. So when the mind is really, really leaning and then flowing in that direction, that's when you really don't have to put as much work into cultivating wholesome thoughts. And that's what I would say. You start to develop a less wordy flow to the experience of remaining satisfied, and you maybe just have to tweak an old habit that arises here and there, but they're so clear. That's that knowledge and vision of the way things are when the mind is in this state of continuous satisfaction, this continuous peace and letting go. When the old habits arise, they're like at a distance. You can see them coming from far away, and you're able to make whatever adjustment is necessary quite easily.
Okay, that makes sense. What I was thinking when you're explaining that, I think the way I define attitude is sort of it's like an emotion that's causing thoughts to come up, right? So like sometimes thoughts can cause emotions to come up, but also if there's an emotion there already without any thoughts, that can cause more thoughts to come up. So if you're already feeling satisfied sort of thoughts will come up because of that emotion, and you won't have to put as much effort into like consciously putting those thoughts in there, because the sort of attitude of satisfaction is sort of like an
Yeah.
emotion there. Would you see it sort of like that?
Yes, I would. I personally make a distinguish between feeling and emotion, and I won't get into that right now, but one thing that came up when you were talking about that was that when Dhammarato, in one of his older conversations from like 5 years ago, he was talking about the third tetrad of Anapanasati, where you're dealing with the mental states, the emotional states of the mind, after having examined the second tetrad, where you're dealing with feeling. And he said, what you discover is that feelings condition the mind. I don't know if I'm going to remember this exactly, but he said, if you're wise, then you can flip that pattern of conditioning so that instead of feelings conditioning your attitude conditions your feelings and your thoughts. So you reverse the order of conditionality there, of determining where, somebody says something negative to you, and that becomes a thought in your mind because you assume that those words, you take them personally. Those become your own thoughts at that point. And then that puts you in a bad mood, right? But when you see the causality moving in that direction, you can reverse the order. When you see it with enough wisdom and you practice it, you train it, you can reverse the order where the attitude is conditioning the feelings and the thoughts instead of the feelings conditioning the attitude. So yeah, it's like you said, like attitude is similar to mood, but I wouldn't say it's 100% similar to mood, because it's sort of having the right attitude, sort of, in my opinion, takes you to a place where moods no longer dominate your life. You're not just born as one mood or the other. You're sort of in a flow of nice, clean, happy, wise awareness. I don't know how to describe it.
Okay, so you're saying like the attitude is not like an emotion. Would you say it's closer to like a belief you have?
I wouldn't say it's like a belief necessarily. Like I said, it's almost, you almost have to think of it in almost like in physics. Like it's more like a direction of movement, so the three kilesa of greed, hatred, and delusion, these are three movements of mind. You can say, greed is when mind moves towards an object. So an object that is pleasing, the mind unconsciously, ignorantly moves towards it. When an object is displeasing or is unpleasant, the mind unconsciously, ignorantly repels, pushes it away, runs away from it. And when an object is neither pleasant nor not unpleasant, which means the mind can't discern whether it's good or bad, because of the habit of chasing after pleasing things and running away from displeasing things, the mind then becomes confused and uncertain, it oscillates, it spins. So it develops. So it's like either going towards, moving away, or spinning around. Those are the sort of three movements of mind. And these three movements of mind like spin, weave your whole narrative construct of reality. That's sort of what's at the foundation of what's constructing the self, the world. Well, actually, the world comes first, and then the self, and then all that relationship between all of that. But the way that I think of right attitude, this attitude of satisfaction, is that attitude of the second path factor of letting go, of renunciation, which is instead of the mind moving in one direction or the other, it's unmoved. It remains unmoved. It moves towards letting go. I guess if you can call that a movement, it's sort of it's a dropping. Something's tossed and then you drop it, and the pleasure that you get from that is the pleasure of letting go, the pleasure of weightlessness, the pleasure of being without anxiety, being without fear, being without desire, being without greed, being without delusion, being without stimulation. So I wouldn't call it a belief. I wouldn't call it an emotion. I would call it a standpoint, maybe, that is at the threshold of the three perceptions of anicca, dukkha, anatta, where the arising and passing states, the arising and passing phenomena, the thoughts, moods, emotions, feelings, memories, all that kind of stuff, doesn't seem to make contact with the mind anymore. It is seen to come near and then fall away without being taken up, without being taken personally, without being grasped at as me or mine. That's the way that I would put it.
Yeah, it's kind of like being in the middle of the eye of the storm.
Mm-hmm.
And, when you're in a hurricane, for example, if you start thinking, oh, I have to go back to my house to get my car, I have to go back home to get my money and bring it with me, instead of just recognizing, oh, I'm in the eye of the storm. This is actually really safe here right now. I don't need to go back, or I don't need to go looking for something else.
Mm-hmm.
This is at peace right here, right where I'm at right now. And when we, just as Michael was saying, when we try to carry things around, that's heavy. And so, thoughts, emotions, feelings, etc., all these things can still arise. They can still sort of fly around you, if you will. But if you don't pick them up, they don't have any weight to them. If you try to grab something, out of the hurricane while the winds are spinning
Mm-hmm.
around, it's going to cut you. It's going to hurt you. It's, there's all sorts of different ways you can get mangled by going into the storm, right? So we don't have to go into the storm. Yeah.
Both Michaels. Well said.
And what's interesting about that is, the Buddha calls Nibbana the island. And Buddhadasa talks about little Nibbanas that are available to us in every moment or in between moments, right? And what's interesting about what Michael is pointing out in the metaphor of the eye of the storm and the Buddha's metaphor of the island is that the island itself, the eye of the storm itself, is defined by the ocean in the case of the island, or the hurricane in the case of the eye of the storm. So we shouldn't expect, feelings, emotions, thoughts, moods, old karmic habits, old conditionings to cease arising, aspects of personality, even the feeling of self to cease arising. There's a sutta where one of the monks tells the Buddha, I've seen the Dhamma, I've kept my virtue, all these years have passed, but there's still this feeling of self. And the Buddha says, you should see that sense of self and I'm going to butcher it, but he basically says in the same way that the scent belongs to the flower. So what he's saying is that that feeling of self belongs to the aggregates. So that doesn't go away. That sense of subjectivity goes away. What goes away is your sense of ownership of it. So with the knowledge of freedom being gained through relinquishing that sense of ownership, with seeing the sense of uncontrollability and impermanence, with seeing that objects in the world don't bring true satisfaction to the mind, the continuous arising and passing of all of this natural phenomena is what defines where you stand. Like I said, like the ocean or the waves define the shoreline. The hurricane itself defines the eye of the storm. That's how you find the place of peace, by seeing where they arise, but they don't make contact with the mind anymore. You know, and explicitly, as Ajahn Chah points out, it's at the threshold of these three characteristics of anicca, dukkha, anatta, or as Dhammarato teaches, cutting right through that Gordian knot of always returning to that state of satisfaction. You're coming to the shoreline, and so that's a mistake that a lot of people make, is expecting old thoughts, feelings, and emotions not to arise and pass anymore. They will continue to for as long as they have fuel to arise and pass. You're no longer feeling them, or if you're no longer feeling them, they will eventually cease. But you shouldn't expect them to cease right away, because you've been feeling them for a long time. But you can experience satisfaction here and now within that arising and passing, because that arising and passing itself defines that shoreline of freedom. And it's just this place of coolness, like Buddhadasa calls it. It's this place of satisfaction, like Dhammarato talks about. You don't have to jump in and fight the waves. You don't have to go out into the hurricane. You can stand in that place of coolness, that place of stillness, where everything is actually okay exactly as it is.
I have a question about the attitude conditioning the emotion. What is attitude? What's the polygon of? Oh wait, I mean, maybe because I didn't read enough sutras, does Buddha talk a lot about the attitude?
Yeah, he does. Like I said, Sankappa is the second path factor, and it's normally translated as inclination or thought. But the definition of Samma Sankappa is non-greed, non-hatred, non-ill will. Sorry, non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion, and renunciation. So Dhammarato teaches that with one word, which is satisfaction, right? If you're satisfied, you're not going to want things you don't have. If you're satisfied, you're not going to get irritated with things that you don't like. You're not going to hate people because they think differently than you. If you're satisfied, you're not going to get confused because you're just looking at the way things are. As the Buddha says, all doubts vanish when he discerns a phenomena with its cause. So that's seeing things as they are here in front of you right now. And when you're already satisfied, you're not going to pick things up and carry them around. That's that renunciation, that letting go. So this is the inclination of a samana, is to remain satisfied. The way that we all live our lives from our early childhood is by wanting things that we don't have and gaining our pleasure from getting things, right? Things that stimulate our senses, like toys and television and delicious food. And those things aren't inherently bad. But if you keep the mind in a perpetual state of stimulation, you never realize the pleasure of a mind that is not stimulated, right? The word for sensuality in the suttas, we can better think of it nowadays, or not better think of it, but we can understand it nowadays as a sensory stimulation. And you hear all around you nowadays, like addiction to dopamine and dopamine fasting and sensory detox. These are people who are like trying to experience this piece of limiting the stimulation of the senses. But the right attitude is to incline towards that, to incline towards more peaceful states, lower stimulation to no stimulation. People in their 20s want to go out and party and drink, and then people in their 30s want to do it less. People in their 40s are probably completely over it, right? The mind does incline towards, hopefully, if you're maturing, greater states of renunciation. But as a practice in the Dhamma, you're wising up much earlier, and you're doing it in a much more complete way.
Yeah, so Samma Sankhalpa, non-greed, non-ill will, non-delusion, that is an attitude.
Yeah, it's a leaning, it's an inclination of the mind.
Mm.
So the way we use attitude colloquially works just fine, right? Somebody who has a bad attitude, then they're gonna have a negative response to all. They're gonna have a negative emotional response to all their experience because they're already disposed in that way, right? They're already inclined to have that response. And somebody who has a good attitude is gonna like look on the bright side of things. They're gonna look on the positive side of things. So you can see those as different personality traits. So that
yeah,
your traditional way of understanding attitude works just fine, I would say.
Oh no, yeah, but it always confused me, to be honest. On some level, when Dhammarato used the word attitude.
Okay, think of it as like balance in a way. And as Dhammarato points out in engineering, the right attitude of a building is perpendicular to the ground, so a gust of wind isn't going to knock it over. And so this metaphor works differently than the tree falling metaphor, but it gets the point across. So if you walk with balance, then you're not going to trip and fall constantly. But if you walk with a lean to one direction or the other or forward, if you're walking off balance, then you're going to trip and fall a lot. So a mind that is leaning towards greed or leaning towards hatred or leaning towards delusion, that's the wrong attitude, the wrong leaning of the mind. Then when something makes contact with the mind, it's going to fall into greed, fall into hatred, or fall into delusion. Whereas the mind that has the right attitude of being perfectly perpendicular, perfectly balanced, when it makes contact with the world, it's not going to fall into greed, hatred, delusion. It's just going to remain unaffected. It's going to remain balanced.
I have because I would say it would be ideal if there's nothing make contact with the mind, but unfortunately, I guess as a lay people, it's impossible. And I was thinking, so once the senses or whatever make contact with the mind, what helps is the balance, right? The attitude,
Mm-hmm.
to balance things back. So even in the context of something irritated by make contact, you can able to bring it back. Is the attitude.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And right attitude culminates in samadhi. Well, right attitude together with right view, and then a solid virtue, right?
Yes.
And right effort, cultivating wholesome thoughts, banning unwholesome thoughts, continuity of mindfulness. So always maintain composure, presence of mind. Anyway, those things together make the mind composed, and a composed mind is a balanced mind. Everything's gathered together, everything is clear, and it becomes unshakable in that state. That's why samadhi is the last of the Noble Eightfold Path. It's really the culmination of all the other path factors in that sense, or in the jhana framework, it's the culmination or the gathering together of the jhana factors. So it's a composition. Samadhi is a composition of mind. It's when everything that needs to be there is there together in balance and harmony. It's like homeostasis, right? And so if you walk into a room with a composed mind, with an attitude of letting go, non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion, and someone slaps you hard across the face, you're not going to have an emotional response to it. There might be a logical response to it. There might be a wise response to it, let's say. But the mind gets pretty disenchanted by unconscious emotional reactions to the world. You start to see that stress, worry, anxiety, anger, all of those unconscious, evolutionarily programmed drives don't have any use. They become sort of absurd. And so you keep a cool head, you stay composed, you stay balanced. Let's say your parents trigger you, it's actually hard. It's like family is like the last thing that you actually get over. I think that you develop pretty good composure out in the world around strangers pretty easily first, and then maybe around coworkers and your boss next, but last would be family.
Yeah.
But eventually even family can't stir you up. There's no buttons left. I always say, like, nobody can push your buttons if you have no buttons. That's another way of putting it. All your buttons disappear, so there's nothing there to push. You don't have these easy triggers. The way that we normally live our lives is like robots, where you push this button, anger comes out. You push this button, happiness comes out. You push this button, despair comes out. You push this button, laughter comes out. You push this button, tears come out. That's how we normally live our lives when we're unconscious and driven by our programming. But when we live our lives with mindfulness and wisdom, then we see sort of how the organism works so clearly, and we see this place of coolness, this place of satisfaction where there's actually true refuge, where there's true happiness, and we sort of remain here. It's like Ajahn Chah calls it our real home. This is our home. We're here in this place of peace. It's our true home. It's where you're comfortable. And Ajahn Chah says, take the one seat in your true home, right here in the mind. Don't let anything draw you outside. And when visitors come, like defilements come to visit, you're already sitting there, and the only seat there is, they'll look around, they'll see there's nowhere to sit, they'll leave. So you just stay in the one seat. This is another metaphor that's brilliant that Ajahn Chah puts it. Just stay in the one seat here in your true home, in this composed, happy, satisfied mind that doesn't need anything outside of itself. Like Ajahn Mun said, he defines the first and second noble truth as the mind going outside of itself is suffering, and the third and fourth, he says, the mind not going outside itself is the end of suffering. It's a reflexive thing, the mind. It splits and then it unifies.
Yeah, and I was thinking, it's like you said, a button, and usually for normal people, we have a lot of buttons, and my understanding is, as I was thinking of like quality seclusion, something Dhammarato always talk a lot about, going somewhere alone, just staying quiet, sitting quiet. I think that really helps in removing a lot of the buttons, right? Like there's still buttons. It gets lesser. That's how I feel.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, you can say that every time you keep replacing the batteries, so many more batteries in what's fueling those buttons to work. It's that taking ownership, that emotional response, to experience that fuels it. I mean, the Buddha talks about the 4 forms of clinging, which the word upadana in its earliest etymology means fuel. and we could think of upadana as attachment or taking ownership. But there's 4 different ways that we fuel this process, this latter process of dependent origination, that it results in the sense of self in the world and the dukkha that comes with it. And it's, it's attachment to identity, attachment to sensory pleasures or sensory stimulation, attachment to views, beliefs, opinions, and attachment to rules, rites, and rituals. These are all of the things that we define ourselves by. If you read an about me, that's what it has in there. It has like, this is me, this is mine, this is who I am, this is what I believe, this is what I like and I don't like, right? The beliefs are the views and opinions. The likes and dislike is the sensuality. This is me, this is who I am is the identity view. And then, your beliefs about what's the right things in the world, those are your rites and rules and rituals. These are the constituents of our identity. And this is what fuels the clinging and the craving and the self in the world and whatnot. But I want to put that down for a minute, because I saw Shamil had his hand up, and I thought possibly you had a question, Shamil.
Oh, I was just wondering about like this in regards to sense restraint, which you brought up a while ago, which was an interesting thing I didn't really know about. Where you like stop yourself from like even having the thoughts to begin with, so that that energy doesn't like affect like I don't know how to describe it. You like I don't know exactly. I watched one like Dhammarato talk on it that's sort of related to it, where it was sort of described as like being in between like pleasurable and unpleasurable thoughts, but not being gravitated towards either, and that prevents like craving and unwholesome thoughts from arising. But I don't fully understand how you go about doing that, I guess.
Yeah, I wouldn't have said stopping the thoughts. What I would have said in regard to sense restraint is that, the Buddha uses the metaphor of tying the senses to a post like you would tie a wild animal to a post. So like if you went out and captured a wild elephant and a wild horse and a wild bull and a wild snake or whatever, and they have their wild instinct in them and you wanted to tame them, you would tie them to a post and they would thrash around and thrash around and thrash around, and eventually they would calm down, and then they would cool down, and then they would sort of realize how much nicer it is to be calm and cool and tame. And this is an analogy the Buddha uses for mindfulness of the body. So it's sort of keeping the senses connected to the body, in the sense that instead of focusing on the objects of the senses, like what you see and what you see evokes in terms of like desire and meaning, you remember that what you see is arising dependent on the body as its foundation, and therefore is not something that you own and not something that's pleasurable. But that's getting more into the insight side of it. So the way that I like to explain sense restraint that I think is more clear than that is, when on my second call with Dhammarato, he doesn't advocate for long sitting meditations, because people approach meditation with craving, right? They sit for long periods of time because they're trying to get something. So then they're just sitting there wanting stuff. It's the most ridiculous thing in the world. Now I see it that way now. What I had said to him at the time is that the way that I think of the sitting practice, the formal practice, as like detox. So somebody, I've used this metaphor a million times, but somebody who's addicted to something and is caught in the addiction, and all the stories and the narratives and the friends and the identities that keep you valuing that object of addiction, as long as you keep feeding the addiction, you feel okay. When you're not on the drug or the alcohol, there's a desire for it, and then if you get it soon enough, then you don't have to experience the discomfort of that desire for too long. But if you go into detox, then boom, you don't get the drug anymore, right? And the addiction is going to start going nuts. It's going to start giving you withdrawals. And so then you learn at that point how enslaved you are by the substance, because without it, you're in a lot of pain. And, learning your dependency on it, hopefully you become disenchanted and sort of repelled by it because it's the state that's enslaving you. Well, it's the same thing with the senses, right? I mean, you've seen videos of parents who take video games away from their kids and they go nuts. And like a few of these meetings ago, I tried to use this to like talk about my little black case for my headphones to talk about the three doorways to Nibbana, or the three doors of liberation. But what I had forgotten is there's a perfect example of this, which is the practice that Bodhidharma brought to China, which is wall gazing. The reason that Bodhidharma brought wall gazing to China is because when you stare at a wall, it doesn't evoke anything familiar to you. It doesn't stimulate the eye, it doesn't stimulate the ear, it doesn't stimulate the mind. And then you can sort of see how dependent the mind is on sensory stimulation. And this is the purpose of seclusion, right? So going into a seclusion practice, or going into a retreat, or doing a seclusion practice at home, going camping, or sitting in a quiet room, whatever it may be, turning off the computer, not socializing, not eating the chocolate cake, or whatever it is that gratifies the senses, not doing that then reveals how conditioned by that sensory gratification the mind is, how dependent on that sensory gratification the mind is on. And if you sort of withstand that pressure, that discomfort that arises in you long enough, then you can witness the degradation of it. There's different ways to look at it. You can look at how fleeting the pleasure is. You can apply the perception of impermanence to the how fleeting the pleasure of sensory gratification is. But you can also look at like the sheer dukkha of it, which is that like we're slaves to our senses. They're like animals dragging us around. Everything we do in life is to receive some kind of sensory gratification. We'll run out of our house to go look at a sunset, or to like watch pretty girls walk down the street, or whatever it may be. We'll have music playing in our ears all day to keep the mind stimulated with pleasing sounds. We'll eat delicious foods constantly to keep our bodies and our tongues stimulated with delicious food and whatnot. And it's only when you stop feeding the senses what they want that you can see how much power they have over you. So that's the purpose of sense restraint, and that's the traditional. I think Dhammarato points out there's two different paths: the mundane path that starts with restraint and then goes into wisdom, and then there's the super mundane path that starts with wisdom and then develops that wisdom to the point that restraint comes as a result of it, or virtue comes as a result of it, which means that if you have the wisdom to see that you can be satisfied already without those things, and you maintain that satisfaction, then the desire for them naturally falls away. And that would be the way that Dhammarato teaches the Dhamma. But the mind and the habits can trick you into taking that attitude of satisfaction as permission to continuously indulge the senses. And the reason that in the terms of traditional Buddhism, that this is a practice of abstaining from gratifying the senses is because the Buddha defines Nibbana as the stilling of all formations. You're training the mind to take delight in non-activity, non-stimulation, non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion. You're training the mind to take pleasure in peace rather than the opposite of peace, like staying at home rather than going to the club is the gross way that I explain it. You're training the mind to be happy at home within itself rather than needing to go out to the senses for stimulation. So that's the purpose of sense restraint. And I like to say, for me, since I've done both practices, is that this practice of starting with satisfaction or remaining satisfied is itself a type of sense restraint that kind of comes from the inside out in a way. You remind yourself that there's this place of peace already here and you can stay here, and gradually you can let go of the habits that draw you out of this place of peace, this place of satisfaction, what Ajahn Chah calls your real home, circling back to that. But
May
so
I
think
comment
I don't,
on sense restraint?
yeah, go ahead.
Well, I would assume that all of you have practiced. Well, okay, no assumption. We'll just talk from my experience. When I was younger, um, 18 or so, younger than that, obviously. Like a lot of males, I wanted to look at girls' boobies, But that's creepy if you do that openly and obviously. So you restrain your senses so that you just don't stare. And, eventually you just don't really care to look anymore. I mean, keep your eyes on their eyes and deal with them like a human being. And, you get a whole lot more out of it that way. To put the metaphor very crudely.
I think that's a good example.
Kind of interesting. It could apply to like, I don't know. I think I was just kind of curious about it because it did seem sort of different from like starting from being satisfied, where you sort of like you like you said, it's the mundane versus super mundane. I think I've still been, like I still enjoy doing super mundane practice more. I'm just always this is probably like a not wanting. I'm just really scared that of enabling myself to start doing things that are more self-indulgent than helpful as a result of satisfaction, which I've been very I've been like I'll trust my wisdom on this, and if I make a mistake I'll just try again. But it was just an interesting concept of going the other way that I didn't know about. Just cool.
Well, you have to remind yourself that if you're doing sort of indulgent things, as you said, then that means that you're not satisfied without it. But if you go and do the indulgent things, then Dhammarato would say, then just do it and enjoy it. Just if you're gonna do it and then enjoy it. Because if you do it and then you feel so bad about it, then you're gonna create more bad feelings in your body that were the thing. And the reason you're pursuing these things is to get away from bad feelings. So if you add more bad feelings when you do it, then you're going to continue to do it more because you just have more bad feelings, and it becomes a cycle, right? So there's a balance in there. It requires practice. It requires paying attention. It requires discussing the practice with friends. It requires self-honesty, and there's a point where that place of satisfaction within the mind becomes very clear, and it's easier to return to, I think, if you keep it up.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can just say this is good enough, regardless of what we're doing.
Cool. Yeah.
It's like
Michael,
someone.
do you teach this to your students in your high school classes all the time, or no?
What was the question?
Do you apply this when you work as a teacher, for education all the time, or no?
Yeah, I would say I do, in a way. I mean, it's hard to answer because my approach to the Dhamma has evolved and changed over a long time, and I've never really kept it out of the classroom. It's just because it's too much a part of who I am. So, I mean, I generally have a very happy nurturing, like, forgiving attitude in the classroom. If I guess that's what I could say about that. And but yeah, I don't know.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Mikey.
No, you're all right. No worries.
No, Mikey puts things simply very well. Like puts things in a clear. I love it when Mikey interjects because I'm like going on for 20 minutes and then Mikey will say something for half a second. And I'm like, thank you, Mikey.
Everybody
Yeah.
like waits for him to pick up his like iPhone like mic thing.
Yeah. That's why we call him Mikey. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
You gotta like pick up the earbud and like drop it in front of the camera, like a mic drop.
Yeah, just putting a little bit more there is like when we say this is good enough, when we practice that, that is the practice, that is the antidote that can apply to all dukkha, all dissatisfaction. So if the dukkha is, oh, we're craving cigarettes and we can't put the cigarettes down, and we have a cigarette in our mouth right now and it's lit up, and we're taking a drag of the cigarette right now, we can say, oh, this is good enough. And that way, that next drag isn't calling to us so strongly. Or another way to put it is, we're not so strongly called to that next drag.
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing's true
It's
with
so
drinking, eating chocolate cake, chasing after girls. Whatever it is that you are involved with in that process right now, if you can say, this is good enough right now, then you don't have to keep on craving more of whatever that thing is.
I think
exactly.
yeah, that has been like the biggest antidote to like someone a like recovering overthinker, where like I'll be like, oh man, I don't know how to like address this problem, and then like I'll think about like Dhamma practice and be like, oh, even if this goes like completely dog shit, I do it wrong, like it's still good enough. And it's
Yeah,
been so fun to like,
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, you're good enough as an overthinker. That's okay.
Yeah, like it's
Yeah.
like, okay, I wasted like 45 minutes like thinking about this. I can actually just put it down and say I wasted that time, but we're still fine. We try again.
I mean, one of my favorites has been, glad I don't have to think about that anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know.
Or just, I don't need that, Yeah, I don't need it. But it works. It works really well.
Yep. Does anyone have any cool moments where they've applied the Dhamma in their life they'd like to share? I always like hearing those.
Well, today, like I've been trying asking myself the question, how can I have as much fun as possible right now? And I noticed like I'd have like more sort of closer conversations with my coworkers, and I could tell like they like really enjoyed the like sort of connection there. Because usually I'm just like, oh yeah, I'll just say like a few things. Oh yeah, I had a good weekend or whatever. I did this and this. But I sort of like when it was like a lot more fun. Like whenever they said something, I thought of it as a game. Like how can I make the conversation fun? And just like having that different mindset of like, how could it be more fun? And like it sort of created more of a fun like experience
Like
through the whole day.
starting from a point of like being satisfied with your social interaction and being like, oh, let me see where I could like go take this, instead of like
Yeah,
just
so
being
often like I would normally have thoughts of what I have to do later at work, or like, oh, I have to get this done before lunch or something like that, right? So that's sort of like a dissatisfying, like future thinking. But when you're thinking, oh, what could I do right now to have as much fun as possible? That's sort of like a present moment sort of thinking, and it doesn't have as much of the like future, oh, I have to do this, oh, I don't really want to do that. So there's a lot more positive emotions. It's a lot easier to be satisfied with that sort of mindset or thinking if you go the whole day sort of thinking right now, how could it be more fun? Well, not like I feel bad now because I'm not having as much fun. It's like, what could I do to have as much fun as possible now? So that's sort of, yeah, it's been working for me in terms of, like, I've felt a lot less dissatisfaction today doing that.
Yeah, delight in the Dhamma. The Dhamma is fun. Enjoy life.
So yeah, like it's like replacing, oh, I have to finish this right away because I'll be busy with something soon, or I have a meeting coming up, I have to get this done. Instead, you're like, you change your thought into something like, oh, like how could I make this more fun? Oh, like even if you don't come up with an answer, like my mind already knows what fun is. Like I'm good at playing and having fun, so I sort of play the part of being a worker, but I know it's just like play pretend, and it's just like sort of being more fun, like being in the moment playing and not really thinking, oh, this has to get done before my meeting, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you can
Like fun
This,
toys to
play
play with.
yeah, exactly. You can play your job instead of taking it seriously.
there's something really interesting about the mind. If I'm not mistaken, it's like nucleus accumbens. Am I pronouncing that correctly? But there's a part of the mind that really try for novelty. And I was thinking, because like novelty stimulates dopamine and all that kind of good stuff. And I feel like having fun is one way of activating the nucleus accumbens and like all that good chemicals. So yeah, I think so happy to hear that. I have a quick question actually of Dream Destroyer just share. Um, yeah, I can also like yeah, it's really true. I really like what he said about what you can do right here, right now, which rather than something in the future or this very overthinking mind of planning, it is so dissatisfying once I see it clearly. It's really helpful. My question is just sometimes I'm around people that, well, I mean, because I guess it's a problem of mine. Sometimes if I'm not careful, if I'm not mindful, I get influenced by people. Like they will behave in such a way, and then it kind of disturbs my mind, and I catch them. I catch that I fall back to my old ways, which is like over planning and overthinking because I'm mirroring what I see, how my coworkers behave. Maybe I yeah. I think it's less of a question. Maybe it's just a challenge I face. I just have to be mindful of that, you know.
Yeah, so it's like when you notice that the most important thing is that you notice it, right? So then you can actually make a change.
Yeah,
So
100%.
like let's say next time you notice it, you could try the same thing that I was doing or have your own thing. But like you could say like right now, what could I do to make the situation more fun? And
Mm.
just so you're sort of like trying to focus on like right now what's happening instead of like, oh, I have to plan for something right now because it's like really important that I plan for what to do. Just like forget about that, which might be hard, but then if you ask yourself a question, it'll put your mind in the present, like how can I make it fun now? Or like, but it's good that you're at least mindful of it. And that's what I think if you do some secluded practice, that can help with you to pick that out more often, notice those patterns when you're you'll notice patterns where you're being triggered more often if you practice your concentration and mindfulness of your thoughts.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, like what you said just reminded me asking the right questions. I think something I can do in the event that I get influenced, I can just ask myself like, what is happening right now? What can I do with this? Yeah.
Like
Yes.
I was thinking about what you mentioned about your culture. You posted on Discord about the high expectations in your culture.
Yeah.
And so it's clear that the critical parent, as Dhammarato talks about, is deeply ingrained in you, right?
Yeah.
And so a good focus for your practice would be to practice that nurturing parent that Dhammarato talks about. Being very nurturing to yourself throughout the day, being very forgiving to yourself throughout the day, not holding yourself to very high standards, congratulating yourself when you are successful, forgiving yourself for everything. There's eventually getting to the point where you can have no standard that you hold yourself against, right? As in we talk about Buddhadasa's interpretation of the Garden of Eden, where judgment is what destroys paradise. Essentially, just to keep it simple, you're destroying your paradise, the paradise of your own mind, your own experience of life, by judging yourself constantly. And that's something that a lot of us have. We're trained to judge ourselves and to have a standard and hold ourselves to that standard. And there's nothing wrong with having sort of goals in life, but there is something wrong with being critical to the point that we take all the joy out of life. There's a saying, comparison is the thief of joy. And you don't want to constantly steal the joy out of everything you do. So practice being nurturing, practice being forgiving, imagine a person. Like for me, I always like to imagine a character who is like just the illustration of like somebody who's like Nibbana, And for some reason, I've said this before, I think in maybe the Saturday Hangout, but like Luke Wilson's character in Family Stone is like the coolest, like chillest, happy character that I like to think of. He's just like really laid back, totally chill, no hangups, no attachments, totally Nibbana. But for you, I think what you should try to do is imagine like the most nurturing parent you can imagine, like if your grandma or your aunt or your mom were very nurturing, like what would your vision of a very nurturing parent be? And then make that nurturing parent be the parent that you carry around in your mind. It's like, don't worry, Ivan, okay, everything's just fine. You're wonderful. Like just really nurture yourself, because a lot of things you say, you're also hard on yourself, and you have this habit of being critical and judgmental of yourself and holding yourself to these like impossible standards and digging potholes for yourself to fall in and things like that. So like, I think for you, you really need to just be very nurturing and forgiving from the moment you wake up until you fall asleep, and even in your dreams, if possible.
Thank you.
Not only this is good enough, but you are good enough. You are good enough.
Yeah, remember to smile.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. If you have like, if you're really hard on yourself, if you find phrases that you deep down believe that
Mhm.
are also making yourself feel better about yourself, like I tried my best, like my best is all I can do, my best is good enough, or something that actually resonates with you instead of just saying something that you don't believe at all, sort of like working your way into believing in yourself more and more. I think if you have like emotional, like you actually believe what you're saying, it'll work better than like copying what other people tell you to say.
Yeah, definitely. Like you were talking about, Jordan, having that playful attitude. It's part of your personality to be playful, to see things as a play. We all have our own ways of thinking that work for us, ways of framing our experience. When the mind settles down into the present moment, it becomes very clear that everything is just fine, that this is good enough. And then when we think back on all the things that we were concerned about throughout the day, it all just seems completely absurd. It was just a movie we got lost in. It was just a story that we believed. And now that story is meaningless.
Yeah, that's true. Like once you become present, you'll notice that the only way that there could possibly be a problem is if you think of it. If you like create
Exactly.
it with your mind. Like the present moment is actually perfect if you look at it, but uh you create problems and it's sort of like you don't notice that when you're just normally going about your day. You think like, oh yeah, there are a bunch of problems going on. I'm hard on myself and stuff like that. But if you actually get into a meditative state and you actually take a look at what's going on, like the present moment is perfect. You can't find anything wrong with it unless you actually imagine something wrong.
You just keep looking at things as they are without interpreting them, adding all the stories to them, and let them be exactly what they are. Like in the Vihya Sutta, the scene in the scene is just the scene, and the hearing is just the hearing, and the tasting is just the tasting, the smelling is just the smelling, and in the feeling is just the feeling. Like I used to get disgusted and then angered by the smell of my kids' diapers when I changed them. And I was like, this is completely ridiculous. This is absurd. I'm letting myself become emotionally triggered by a smell. And now, and the smelling is just the smelling. Took some work to get there, though.
I'm really glad I didn't have to do that. Yeah, we'll see.
I've gotten to this point where I used to only listen to monastics teach the Dhamma. I used to be like a heavy bias against lay practitioners. And now, like, I feel like my bias is going in the other direction. Like, I'm like, I'd like to see Ajahn Yanamoli with kids. He's out there chopping wood, hanging out with dogs in the forest. I love camping. Okay, I'm like the happiest dude. I'd like to see him change diapers while kids are crying and hungry. Multiple baths and all
Children
that
are the
stuff.
ultimate test of your enlightenment.
Yeah. So if I can embody the Dhamma while, parenting, then it's a strong Dhamma.
Something something that has been really helpful for me was, this is so subtle. Sometimes I catch myself judging, oh, why am I still attached to this? Why am I still triggered to this? And Brad told me that he said something about, I mean, I think this is where reflection comes to play. It's so helpful at reflecting how I was even a year ago. I know for sure I'm way more satisfied, way more happy, and way more peaceful. So rather than thinking that, well, I haven't yet able to whatever, I can just, oh, okay, this is good enough. And also, like, I can see the tendency of me rushing for something, like, like, oh, I wish I'm more enlightened, or whatever that means. And I can see how absurd that thought is. I can throw that out. Really reminds me of what Dhammarato always says, like, Dhamma is like a snake, depending on which end of the tail you are grabbing it. If you're grabbing it by the tail, it's going to come back and bite you. It rings more and more true to me. The more clearly I see how sometimes I just fall into the victim myself. Oh, poor me, I can't get this right. What's wrong? What's wrong with my practice? And it's like, oh, okay, there's another unwholesome thought.
You know what's interesting about the simile of the snake that you just brought up is I hear just about everybody who teaches the Dhamma, like monastics who teach the Dhamma, bring up that simile. And when the Buddha uses the simile, he's basically saying that picking up the Dhamma so that you can learn it and then use it to win debates or disparage others or preach at people is like grabbing the snake at the wrong end. It's going to bite you. But when you use the Dhamma as like a training here and now, then you're grabbing the snake around the throat, essentially. And for me, implicit in that is going straight to Dukkha Nirodha. But what's funny about that is that, in the world of teaching the Dhamma that you see on the internet nowadays, even these like highly developed monastics who've been teaching the Dhamma and practicing their whole lives still spend a whole lot of their time, if not half their time, talking about the way everyone else is doing it wrong. And they'll even talk about the simile of the snake to illustrate that. And I'm like, well, right here, in using the simile of the snake to make the point that everybody else is doing it wrong, you are grabbing the snake from the wrong end because you're using the Dhamma to basically win a debate without someone else there to debate with you, because the actual application of the Dhamma is not really very showy. It's not socially gratifying because it's extremely private. It's in your immediate experience. Are you going from dukkha to dukkha nirodha and experiencing the bliss of that freedom? And that's not something that you can explain or show off. You can talk about it to help other people experience it, but it's sort of like in the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus instructs the people who are listening to him that if they're going to pray, they should pray in a closet. That's, I feel, what the Buddha is talking about in the simile of the snake, that the Dhamma it's a training. It's not an object. It's not a subject of debate. So I love that simile because it's a really great reminder, and then in that same sutta later, he talks about the simile of the raft where it's meant to cross the shore, cross over. It's not meant to be enshrined or carried over after that, so it's not for debate. It's not to be enshrined. It's to get you from dukkha to dukkha nirodha, and that's pretty much it. Very boring externally, You know, it's not socially gratifying. There's no accolades that come with making accomplishments in the Dhamma. Except you become a really happy person that everybody wants to be around.
Yeah, I heard Dhammavidu say once, you know, I have to use a little bit of wrong speech to talk about the Dhamma, because otherwise it would just be so boring and dry.
Yeah. Dhammavidu loves to antagonize all those people sitting there quietly listening to him. Oh man, it's funny. I got a bit of that antagonistic quality in me too. I really like to poke at people sometimes, but that's probably just an old habit I should drop.
Well, there was one thing I was going to say to Ivan is he was talking about, oh, I'm not sure if I'm getting it right, you know, this sort of thing. It's like, just come hang out in Sangha. People will start pointing things out.
Yes,
You don't have to worry about that.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Thank you. That's so true. Never thought of it.
But, you know, what's nice about Sangha is people, you know, at least generally speaking, there's an environment that encourages civility, kindness.
Yes, I agree.
Well, as long as it's in good spirit, don't stop poking fun at people. I mean, that's what makes Zen so fun.
Yeah, sure.